Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marcella Paris, and as the director of the Lewiston Public Library, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Great Falls Forum. The Forum is a monthly speaker series featuring leaders in the areas of business, public policy, academia, and the arts, and is a partnership of Bates College, the Sun Journal, and the Lewiston Public Library. This is the 24th season of the program, so we thank you for your ongoing support. A recording of today's program will be available starting tomorrow on the library's YouTube page. You can also visit lplonline.org for more information. Please mark your calendar for the next Great Falls Forum, which will happen on Thursday, April 21st, also at 12 noon, featuring Amy Smith, who is the founder and executive director of Healthy Homeworks, and her talk will be entitled Falling in Love with Lewiston. More information on that will soon be available at lplonline.org. So a little housekeeping for today's program. Those on Zoom are going to see a Q&A option at the bottom of the screen. You can use this to enter any questions for our speaker today. And for those joining us on Facebook Live, you can go ahead and type your questions in the comment box there. Just so that everyone knows, you can ask questions at any point, but we're going to hold on to those and the speaker will address them towards the end of today's talk. Now, today, I have the pleasure to introduce our speaker, Earl Brechlin. Earl lives in Bar Harbor and is the author of Wild, Weird, Wonderful Maine, released in June of 2020 by Island Port Press. He brought the history, magic, and beauty of Maine's North Woods alive in his book, Return to Moose River, published by Down East Books in 2018. And in 2019, the book won the John Cole Award for Maine-themed nonfiction from the Maine Literary Awards. An adjunct faculty member in journalism at the College of the Atlantic for 17 years, Earl worked as an editor, journalist, and investigative reporter in Maine for more than 37 years. He is a former board member and instructor for the Acadia Senior College and currently serves as president of the Bar Harbor Historical Society. Earl is the holder of more than 100 awards for news and feature writing and photography. A registered Maine guide, he's a former Maine Journalist of the Year and is the author of 8 books, including adventure and hiking guides, the Maine and Acadia National Park, and postcard history books about regions of Maine, Cape Cod, and New England. Without further ado, I am pleased to welcome Earl Brechlin to the Great Falls Forum.
Oh, thank you very much, Marcella. Welcome everyone on a somewhat smurry Thursday afternoon, but I know we're going to spend some great time here talking about wonderful things about Maine. And, you know, I think Maine is just one of those original states that just has so many wonderful stories. And over the years, when I was researching the Moose River book or other things, you get these little tidbits and little towns' claims to fame and legends. And I just sort of started collecting them, and it turned into the book that is Wild, Weird, Wonderful Maine. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen here and we'll get started. So I'm honored to be a part of the Great Falls Forum series and want to thank the Lewiston Public Library and Bates College and the Sun Journal. I have a lot of great friends over there. Your community is lucky to have as great a newspaper as that. Anyway, one of the ideas of getting out Wild, Weird, Wonderful Maine was you were going to have the Maine Bicentennial, which just wrapped up finishing the time capsule that they were doing and what have you. And I think that that's one of the impetuses for this, and it kind of fell in at a good time. Wild, Weird, Wonderful Maine is actually meant to get you up off the couch and get out and explore Maine. There's about 300 different items sort of sorted by 5 geographical areas throughout the state. And at the end of every item that has a physical location, I've included the coordinates for the map and page of the Maine Atlas and Gazetteer. If you live in Maine, you've got to have one in your car, probably one in your office, one at your house, because you can go out and you can still visit some of these places and see how wonderful that is. Anyway, so we'll start out And the first place that I wanted to talk about is Maine's Real Pet Cemetery. And it was on Mackworth Island in Falmouth, which Percival Baxter, who was governor of Maine, oops, sorry, I guess we kind of jumped back here. Let me see if I can straighten that out. Okay, there we go. Between 1921 and 1925, went on to create Baxter State Park. He loved his Irish setters, and he had horses and different animals, and he couldn't bear the thought of just burying them somewhere. So he created this cemetery, and there's a variety of different stones that are there. He liked to name all his Irish setters appropriate on St. Patrick's Day to talk about Gary. He had Gary 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And he was so affectionate towards those dogs that the one that was with him in the State House all the time, when it died, he had the body transported from Augusta back to Mackworth Island, and he ordered the flags over the Capitol in Augusta flown at half staff, which irritated his opponents to no end. There's a nice walking trail there now, and you can certainly go and visit that today. A lot of folks don't realize that Maine was home to several prisoner of war camps during World War II that housed primarily, almost entirely, prisoners from the European theater. And there were facilities in Aroostook County, and Holton was the largest one, but also near Hobbstown and Spencer Lake near Jackman. And that housed over 300 prisoners. And they would work in the woods, they cut ice, they cut pulp. And Aroostook County, they picked potatoes. And in general, it wasn't too tough of a billet, considering some of the other prison camps kind of around the world. Well, they had the biggest escape from the prison camp, when 3 prisoners decided they would try to get away in early March, and they made a compass out of a tin can and a magnetized needle, which, according to one breathless newspaper account, worked as well as one from L.L. Bean. And they got a few rations, and off they went into the woods. Well, they launched the largest manhunt in Maine history. The FBI, the state police, local police, they were trying to find these prisoners. They couldn't find any trace of them. Well, they talked to an old guide who lived near the Forks, and he explained that the high water in this river and the marsh over here, that where they would come out. And so they went down by the Forks and waited, and 5 days later, those 3 prisoners stumbled out of the woods and were glad to go back to the camp. And the children in the Forest Hills School up in Jackman erected the stone, which you see in the picture on the right, at the remains of the camp now, just to memorialize that it had been in that area. And that's the bread oven behind it that was done for, that was part of the camp's mess hall. I think one of the strangest stories from Maine, but also talks about just that Maine resilience and making do, was in 1873, when the brig Lena Thurlow hove into the bay off Cutler with its pennant flying at half mast, which indicated there'd been a death on board. And when they got ashore, the 27-year-old captain explained that his bride, Jeanette Corbett, had died of some terrible tropical disease when they were in Cuba. They had delivered some lumber down there, and they were picking up various cargo. Well, on her deathbed, she had begged him to please don't leave her in Cuba, bring her back to Maine. Well, they had a 6-week journey in July and August to get back to Maine. And so it took some ingenuity in 1873 on how to do that. So they got a large barrel from the local rum distillery and filled it with rum after they had put her body in that, and came back to Cutler. Well, naturally, the captain, he was from a wealthy family, went to the local undertaker and said, "We want it done upright, a nice funeral." The undertaker said, "I'm not opening that barrel." And we can identify today, with having been through a pandemic for the last 2 years, yellow fever was rampant among ship crews, both in New York and in Maine at the time, and nobody wanted to go near it. So they did the next best thing, and they dug a large circular hole in the cemetery and buried her barrel and all. And that's her gravestone in the image on the left, and you can visit that to this day. Back in 1857, the U.S. military, the U.S. Coast Survey, determined they needed all new geographic maps of the United States. And they decided to do that, they needed to create 10 perfectly straight and well-measured lines up and down the East Coast from Maine to Georgia. Well, up in the barrens behind Cherryfield, in that area in Maine, is what they call the baseline. And they surveyed it 5 or 6 times, and Benjamin Franklin's great-grandson, Dallas Bach, was in charge of this whole effort. And they measured over 5 miles to within 2 inches. And that was used as one of the jumping off places. And of the 10 lines that were originally created, there's only 2 that can still be found. They had granite monuments at the end, but those had to be taken to historical societies because people vandalized them. But there's a road that kind of follows the rough route of that baseline. And on the map in the Gazetteer, it says it's called the Baseline Road. And you can still see that to this day. The interesting thing was that the officer supervising that work was Jefferson Davis. Yes, that Jefferson Davis who went on to lead the Confederacy during the Civil War. And this was 3 years before the war broke out. And so he came down and he was told his wife had a lot of illness, that the air on Lead Mountain was perfect for their health. And so they went to down East Maine off what is today's airline in Eddington, and they camped for 5 weeks on top of Lead Mountain. And supposedly Jefferson Davis left a trunk at a local inn and people theorized it had the secret plans for the Civil War, but actually they realized many years later it was just simple surveying documents. Maine has the claim to fame with the Wizard of Oz and the Wicked Witch of the East, who was played by Margaret Hamilton. And she was always, "I will get you, my pretty," but she enjoyed a very quiet life on Cape Island off the village of Newargin near Southport down by Boothbay. And people said she was a very nice lady. She actually fell into the water once when she was getting ready to row out to the island and didn't dissolve in a puff of smoke or a big explosion. And so that sort of put the myth to rest that she was actually a witch. And her family continues to own that property to this day. I think one of the great unsung heroes of Maine, which a lot of folks don't necessarily know a lot about, was Francis Perkins. And Franklin Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, may get all the credit for all the wonderful social programs of the Great Depression. He created the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Public Works Administration. But as his labor secretary, she oversaw beginning a minimum wage and the 40-hour work week and helped do Social Security as well, none of which would have gotten done without the able management of this woman from Maine. And that's the picture in the lower right is her home in Newcastle, which is now the Francis Perkins Center. And later in life, when she reflected on her public service, she lamented that the only thing they didn't get done, which she had wished they had, which was universal health insurance, which we still don't have to this day. One of the major close encounters of the weird kind in Maine happened in 1976 with twin brothers from Massachusetts were canoeing with 2 friends on the Allagash. And they reported after they left a landing on Telos Lake that they saw interesting lights in the sky. And then they all had a long period of time. They couldn't remember what happened. And after hypnosis, reportedly, they had been probed by alien beings. Well, they did report it to the Allagash Ranger, but no one else had seen the UFO. Several years later, one of the men did recant to the St. John Valley Times in a news story that they had consumed a few beers that evening, which I think everyone took for granted. But their entire experience was profiled in the book, The Allagash Abductions. I think 2 of the most incredible characters from Maine's history, we focus on politicians and governors and generals or what have you. Certainly everyone knows Joshua Chamberlain, but I think the Stanley brothers from Kingfield, Maine are just giants. And it was Francis Edgar and Freeland Oscar, and they were born in Kingfield in 1849. And they went to what's now the University of Maine in Farmington and got their education and became teachers, but they were just prolific inventors, and they're best known for their steam car, the Stanley Steamer. Well, in the picture on the right, after they had been building them for a few years, it actually won the hill climb up Mount Washington and beat out other cars of its time. But the Stanleys didn't stop there. They had a big factory in Massachusetts, but spent a lot of time in Maine. And they went on and invented the artist airbrush, which we still use today, and got a patent for that. And they also invented dry plate photography, which was new because you didn't have to use all these toxic chemicals and liquid baths to get the plate ready for exposure. And for more than 2 years, George Eastman, who went on to found Kodak, the Kodak company, tried to buy it, and they kept refusing and refusing, and the price went up and the price went up until finally they said okay, and they got $2.5 million, and Kodak went on to found his empire, which would not have been possible without the Stanley Brothers from Kingfield, Maine. The picture in the upper right was their steam rocket, they called it, that set the land speed record at one point on Daytona Beach in Florida. In the middle on the bottom is the Stanley Hotel out in Colorado, which some people may recognize. It was the setting for The Shining by author Stephen King when he stayed there, decided to set his novel that featured murder and mayhem there. But they were not the only outstanding artists and thinkers in their family. Their sister, Chansonetta Emmons, is the only girl out of 6 boys, 7 children in the family. She was an incredible photographer, and she went around and profiled everyday life in New England back in the late 1800s and took some of the best photos going. So I just can't say enough for that whole family and all that they did. You know, CMP has been in the news and its public relations problems and its relationships with its customers and the towns and communities it serves. But it was also controversial back in the late 40s when they built the Long Falls Dam, which was to help generate electricity and control water to the Wyman Dam downstream on the Kennebec River. And they built that on the Dead River. And the water started to flood several communities in 1950, including Flagstaff and the villages of Dead River. So many people moved their houses, others tore them down, and some were just left behind. And as the waters rose, so there were literally ghost towns under the surface of that lake. I think one of the most unusual aspects of it was that they had over 300 bodies from small cemeteries in these communities that they had to move, which they eventually moved to a brand new cemetery in the village of Eustis, where now the graves are all perfectly straight rows with all the people that they moved. I think one of the most unfortunate things was when the village of Flagstaff was flooded. It was named because that is where General Benedict Arnold, on his ill-fated march to Quebec, supposedly erected the United States flag before they headed further north, and that area was totally flooded out and inundated as well. And of course, that whole mission was profiled in Kenneth Roberts' seminal work, Arundel, which is a really great book. One of the first kind of TV luminaries with connections to Maine, long before Bassmaster Bill Nance or other televangelists of rod and reel, was Roscoe Vernon Gadabout Gaddis, who eventually settled in Bingham, Maine, and started his own airport there, which was named the Gadabout Gaddis Airport. He was best known for his Sunday TV show, where they would go and they would spend an hour. He and a cameraman would fly around the country in his beloved aircraft, and they would fish. And it was all in black and white. And then the show was, all the film was edited and it showed on TV on Sunday. What was really outstanding compared to what happens today, it was reality TV. If they fished for a week and didn't catch a fish, the entire hour was him not catching a fish, which you wouldn't get away with today, but was just wonderful. Eventually his airport is now the Northern Outdoors' whitewater rafting outfit, and the Maine Aviation Association has a major aviation award that they give out every year. That's that's named in his honor. The expression "big as an ox" really came home to roost in Maine. In the early years of the 1900s, there were two ox from the town of Stetson named Katahdin and Granger, and they're fed and they grew larger, and they were working every day, pulling stumps and moving rocks and hauling logs. Eventually, Granger alone topped out at 4,800 pounds, and Katahdin weighed as much as 5,000 pounds. They were such an attraction and such a curiosity that they were taken by train to New York City, came out of Penn Station, and walked down through the middle of Manhattan in 1906 and just stopped traffic. Everybody just had to see the two largest oxen in the world. Katahdin died at age 11, and the farmer Rand, which is a picture of him on the truck with Katahdin, didn't want to lose out on all that wonderful revenue from showing his oxen and what have you. So he had him mounted and stuffed and put on a truck. And then he would go to country fairs and 4th of July parades. And unfortunately, in 1934, he was destroyed in a fire. Granger lived a nice, ripe old age of 17. But it's just kind of a wonderful take on Maine agrarian life. Maine has been visited by plenty of presidents, but this picture of Teddy Roosevelt astride a moose in a lake always kind of captured my imagination. He visited Maine several times as a boy. He climbed Katahdin, including he got about halfway there and he lost a shoe and ended up climbing it with one shoe and one moccasin that someone had loaned him. But he also befriended a couple of Maine guides that up in Island Falls, Bill Sewell, and Wilmot Dow. And in the picture on the left, you'll see Roosevelt is the dandy with the rifle with his two guides. Roosevelt went with Fly Rod Crosby, who was the first registered Maine guide in the whole state, who he met at outdoor shows and things of that nature. So interesting, when I was chasing down the bull moose photo, I discovered that it's a very early example of Photoshop. Of course, Roosevelt never actually rode a moose in a Maine lake, but he was running under the bull moose party, and a New York newspaper took a picture of Roosevelt on a horse and manipulated him to a picture of the moose swimming in the lake. And that ran in papers and publications all over the country with no indication that it was doctored at the time. If you've ever climbed Cadillac Mountain in Acadia National Park on the Northridge Trail, you'll come across this cross chiseled into the pink granite. And for years, people believed that Samuel de Champlain, who first visited the area, the French explorer, in 1604, that his crew had put it there as a marker while they were repairing his ship after he had hit a ledge offshore. He gave the island its name. He called it Ile des Monts Deserts, or Island of Barren Mountains, for the treeless summits. And it's the name we still have today. That legend is great about them chiseling that, but how many times while they were here are they going to walk up that mountain with the tools and chisel away at granite and go back down? And how long did that take and for what purpose? Well, it wasn't until much later in the early 1900s where people realized that there were actually 4 crosses up on the summit of Cadillac, and there are iron posts nearby, and they were surveyor marks for one of the first lots that was given to a group called the Hancock County Trustees for Public Reservations, who then donated that to become Lafayette National Monument, which became Lafayette National Park, and in 1929 became Acadia National Park. So the crosses are significant, but they weren't done by a crew of French sailors in the 1600s. Maine has kind of a love-hate relationship with hell. And there's all kinds of, so the sign in the top center there, God's Country, Set It on Fire, that's up near Cacajou on the east side of Moosehead Lake. There's the Hell Gate near Booth Bay Harbor, where the current ebbs and flows and it's dangerous for mariners. The Devil's Pulpit at Bald Head Cliff. And then there's various Satan chasms and brooks and what have you. I think one of the more interesting ones was up near Milo, where supposedly, and I have not been able to find it, there are imprints on the bedrock from Satan's snowshoes. Now, why if Satan is melting into rock, he'd be out on snowshoes? I don't know. One of my favorites I came across while researching is a place called Hell Before Breakfast Cove, and it's on a lake in Washington County called Sislodopsis Lake. And supposedly in the late 1800s, a man named Sam Hill was moving bark across the lake that they used hemlock bark for the tanneries in the area. And a couple of bundles got loose and started to drift off where they were on shore for their lunch break. And he said he was going to swim back and retrieve it. And they told him, don't, it's dangerous. And he said, I'll fetch it or I'll go to hell before breakfast. Well, he swam out, something happened. He slipped beneath the water and he never came up. And so for years, the maps in that area called that Hell Before Breakfast Cove, which I just think is pretty inventive. I think lots of different food quirks in Maine, but the soggy center of donuts were the inspiration for a 16-year-old Hanson Gregory, who was a steward on a schooner out of Rockport, Maine. And the cakes at the time were square, often uncooked in the center, because when they fried them, the outside would get too well done. He is reportedly the man who invented a little cutter out of tin that then cut the center of the donut hole out. And now the thing was cooked perfectly. He later had copies of his cutter made. His mom and his sisters started a business back home selling all of those. He also used to brag that with the donut with the hole, if you were steering the schooner, you could put the donut on the handles of the ship's wheel so that you could keep your hands free for navigation while having your coffee break. 1940 World's Fair. He passed away in 1921, but they had a whole exhibit and included a portrait. And in the 100th anniversary of his discovery on Old County Road in Rockport near Rockland, they actually erected a stone marker and plaque commemorating the inventor of the donut hole. And you can visit that place today. Long before the name Hannibal was associated with some fava beans and a fine Chianti, Hamlin was known as Hannibal Hamlin, who was Lincoln's vice president and a U.S. senator and ambassador to Spain. And he was from the Norway South Paris area of Maine, born in 1809. He eventually settled over in Bangor and was a prominent citizen there. And while visiting with friends at the Tarotine Club in Bangor, he reportedly collapsed. And they moved him to this couch that you see in the center so that they could try to revive him. They tried with brandy, they tried with smelling salts. And although they said he groggily made a few sounds a couple of times, he passed away about an hour later. His wife had been able to get there and his son. So anyway, they decided to commemorate his passing, and they call this the Hannibal Hamlin Death Couch now. And it's now in the lobby of the Bangor Public Library. And there's a little sign on there that explains what it is and says, please don't sit on the couch. And considering what happened to the last occupant, that's probably not a bad idea. Over in Western Maine, there's a famous mineral called the Bumpus Barrel. And it's one of those odd names that you just see vague references to in some research. And then finally I said, I'm gonna find out what this was. And it was found in the Bumpus Quarry in Albany Township over near Bethel in 1928. And beryl is any large crystal like aquamarine or emerald. And it was 27 feet long and weighed 52,000 pounds, a single crystal, 4 feet long at one end, down to about a foot or so on the other end. They pulled it out in sections and it was shipped all over the world. The American Museum of Natural History and Harvard University. Fortunately, the largest piece that was about 2 tons that still remains from it came back to Maine in 2017, and it's now on display at the Maine Mineral and Gem Museum in Bethel. And so you can go and see that. They have moon rocks. They have a great museum there, and it's certainly worth a visit. Of course, the gem that Maine's most famous for is tourmaline, which also comes from that area of the state. Interestingly enough, in around 1950 or 1815, excuse me, a young boy in Norway, Maine was up on a ridge watching the sunset. And when he turned around an overturned tree, he saw something sparkling among the roots. And he discovered the first tourmaline, which got people interested in looking for gems. And the boy who made that discovery was Hannibal Hamlin's brother, which is kind of interesting that there's kind of a tie there. I like to call this Bangor's very Brady Shootout. And back in 1937, America's public enemy #1 was Al Brady and his gang, and they arrived in Bangor, and they were always wanted for robberies and bank robberies and other crimes. Over 200 different thefts they were involved in. And a clerk at Dakin's sporting goods store got suspicious because these guys came in and they bought a pair of 45 caliber automatic handguns and paid with cash. And a few days later, they came back and inquired if they could buy some machine guns. And the clerk said, well, maybe I know a rum runner that might have one. Why don't you come back? Well, he, of course, called the local police and the FBI. When the gang returned a couple of days later, they were waiting. And when the gang realized that the trap had been sprung, a big shootout broke out outside when the agents came back outside. And Brady and Clarence Schaefer, one of his gang, were shot dead in the street, their bodies riddled with over 60 bullets. And if you go to there today, you'll find there's a little granite stone that says near this spot, kind of commemorating that kind of brush with history. And Brady, nobody claimed his body, and he was buried in Mount Hope Cemetery in Bangor, along with some of the other nefarious denizens of that community's past. If you ride your motorcycle up to Madawaska, at the very tip of Maine, you can visit a place called Four Corners Park. And what happens is it's considered one of the four corners of the United States for people that are riding motorcycles, and it's sort of a circuit that you can do. The other corners are Blaine, Washington, San Ysidro, California, and Key West, Florida. So a local motorcycle rider and dealer came up with the idea of the park, so people actually had a place to go to when they completed their circuit. And it's the only one of the 4 points in this national ride that actually has a park. And it has a granite obelisk. And if you register, you can have a brick put on the ground with your name on it and what have you. This man, Mr. LaChance, who founded the park, also came up with the idea of a Four Corners of Maine ride with stops in Madawaska, Grafton Notch, Kittery, and Lubec. And if you do that 4 times, you sign a paper that testifies you've completed it, and they'll send you a t-shirt and a button that says that you're a member of Maine's Titanium Butt Club for having ridden that far on a motorcycle. And I think it's a great honor for those that can accomplish that. Along with the donut hole, Maine is also considered to be the birthplace of commercial chewing gum. And John Jacob Curtis created the first large-scale chewing gum factory on 4th Street in Portland in 1866. And back then it was spruce gum, and it was certainly co-opted from Native Americans and then the loggers and wood strivers. And they would mix wax with the sticky spruce gum literally coming off the trees, and definitely was an acquired taste. It wasn't the spearmint and peppermint or tea berry that we might all know today. Other flavors were eventually added, and that building is still there. It's now a furniture factory. Another one of Maine's great unique foods is Moxie's soft drink, which was invented in 1876 by Augustine Thompson, who was actually born in Union, Maine. He invented it when he was down in Lowell, Massachusetts, and originally came out, it was called Moxie Nerve Food. And although the formula has never been totally revealed and it's a secret, it reportedly contains gentian root and other flavors. So over the years, a lot of people have really enjoyed it. It's had President Calvin Coolidge only drank Moxie, author E.B. White, and sports great Ted Williams, who actually did advertisements, as you can see on the right. In the upper right corner, they had the Moxie car, which was supposedly driven by a horse that would ride on the car. And also on the left is a picture of the Moxie Bottle House, which now has been brought back to Maine and can be seen at the fairgrounds in Union. It stands a full 32 feet high. Since 1982, the town of Lisbon has held an annual Moxie Festival with parades and block parties and fireworks. So Mainers certainly like their Moxie. Another place with the name Moxie is Moxie Falls, which is up near the Forks, between the Forks and Jackman, or between Rockwood and Jackman area, up in northeast or western Maine. And it's considered one of the highest waterfalls in New England, and perhaps the highest in Maine. There's some discussion on that, but it's 90-foot plunge from the top down to the pool. The stream is named Moxie, but not after the soft drink, although the water is dark and brown stained from the tannins in the water from its headwater lakes. But it's believed to be an Abenaki word for dark water. And there's a nice walkway and observation platforms there. Of course, a couple times every few years, somebody decides to go off those, which results in some tragedies that have happened there in the past. I think one of the great forgotten stories of Maine is called the Tarratine tragedy. And unrelated to the Tarratine Club in Bangor, but there was a little village where the railroad crossed the road between Rockwood and the Forks, or Jackman, excuse me, sort of not far from where Moxie Falls is. And back in the late 1800s, they were completing the Canadian Pacific Railroad line across Maine, and they were doing some dynamiting. And supposedly, this was in 1888, an explosion went off prematurely, and a large number of the immigrant construction workers were killed by the blast. And unfortunately, there are no newspaper accounts that I could find about this, because back then these were considered disposable people. They weren't worth writing about. So even various historians have said that there were 6, others have said 13. So whatever it was a mass casualty disaster. And they were all buried right there next to the railroad. And this obelisk, which is about a mile from the road, if you walk along the railroad tracks, Sons of Italy in 1888 marks that spot. And there's some suggestion that RAM, because the A has a distinctive inverted V of maybe a Masonic symbol. There may be some symbolism there, but little is known about that. And but their sacrifice and their work to connect Canada from sea to sea and to provide railroad service across Maine isn't totally forgotten. Along with animals and just human muscle, the people working in the Maine woods in 1901 finally got some help from an inventor from Waterville named Alvin Orlando Lombard. And he invented the first steam-powered tracked vehicle to haul lumber out of the woods, which we now know as the Lombard Loader. First one was actually christened Mary Ann. He built more than 80 of these devices, which featured tracks under basically a small locomotive, and then 2 big runners up front, which really they're basically 30-ton snowmobiles if you really think about it. They would produce about 50 horsepower and could go about 5 miles an hour, but they could move 300 tons of wood at a time. And so that was a great improvement over just teams of oxen. And it took 3 people, an engineer, a fireman, but somebody had to sit up front and actually steer. And of course, with all the noise and commotion, it had to be a pretty obvious trail, because there was really no talking to the people in the back. Lombard went on to build smaller ones that are more like a truck on a chassis with a gasoline engine. And eventually other states, Michigan, Wisconsin, New Hampshire, all adopted Lombard loaders. And there's still a static display at the Patent Lumberman Museum up in northern Maine. And then the Maine Forest and Logging Museum in Bradley has 2 that are still working that they bring out for special occasions. And it's quite a thrill to see something that big moving along. I like to say there's one cemetery in Rockport, Maine that talks about the best and the worst of childcare. And it all started out in April of 1940 when the body of a 5-month-old baby boy was found floating in an abandoned quarry. He was naked. They couldn't determine how he had died. No cause of death was ever determined, and no one was ever reported missing. There were no reports of missing children. They scoured the records of children that may have been born 5 months previous, and they didn't find anybody missing. They offered a reward of $500 for anything that could lead them to who this baby might have been, but it never went claimed. People did donate money to give him a proper burial in the Seaview Cemetery there in Rockport. And to this day, people bring toys and coins and little stuffed animals just to show that he's not forgotten even across all these generations. Now, ironically, at the other end of the cemetery is the large granite boulder gravestone for Dr. Benjamin Spock. And in 1946, a few years later, he wrote the book Common Sense Book of Baby Care and Child Care, which became the seminal work which most of the baby boomers, myself included, I think my mom wore out 2 copies of that where we had 2 sets of twins, and more than 50 million copies of that were sold. Dr. Spock had a house in Camden, kept his sailboat Turtle in the harbor, and he always enjoyed it. And when he died in 1988, he asked to be buried in Maine. So you can kind of see the best case and the worst all in that one spot. Admiral Byrd, who was Richard Byrd, who was one of the first people to fly over the poles, had a tie to Maine over on Tunk Lake here in Hancock County. And he was, it was called Wiki Up, and it was a big log lodge, and he has ties to Bert and I. And it's kind of a couple of degrees of separation, but Bob Bryan, who worked with Marshall Dodge to record the Bert and I, his father was a contractor that built this lodge for Admiral Byrd. And Byrd was the first to fly over the North Pole in 1926. And then in 1929, he flew over the South Pole, proving no matter what Bert and I say, that you can get there from here. And unfortunately, Wiki Up was destroyed by a fire set by an arsonist in 1984 and was never rebuilt. You know, one of the wonderful things about Maine is that every town wanted a little claim to fame as the capital of this and the capital of that. And I actually have a list of it in Wild, Weird, Wonderful Maine, because Franklin was the granite capital, and Phillips was the toothpick capital, and Belfast was the broiler capital. And so the town of Bryant Pond had several claims to fame, one of them being that its Masonic Hall had one of the first 3-story tall outhouses of any building in New England. And so that building still exists there on the main drag, and it's not to be outdone by next door at the Grange Hall, where they had a 2-story outhouse that's still there, although both buildings have subsequently added modern plumbing, although not until, in the lodge's case, the year 2000. And if you think about it, just down the road, Tucker Carlson from Fox News, he just opened a studio there, so you could distantly argue that the town's scatological claim to fame continues. They also were the famous that they were the last place in the United States to get rid of its hand crank telephones. And you may remember back a few years, in 1983, they had the Don't Yank the Crank campaign. They had 431 people that still had to crank to get their phone to work. So they also have the world's largest telephone that sits on that pedestal there. And then they also have that sign for the old clothespin mill, which is long gone. So anyway, it's definitely a town that wants you to know what its claims to fame are. I always say that people say Hostess Twinkies and cockroaches are the only thing that would survive a nuclear war. And in Blue Hill at George Stevens Academy, they're kind of proving that right. And back in 1976, they took an unwrapped Twinkie and put it in a case to see how long it would go before it would spoil. Well, it's still there. It's looking a little paler than it probably did 40 some odd years, 50 some odd years ago. At the time, Hostess said that the Twinkie's optimum shelf life was 25 days, but here we are all those years later. So now it's been on display for 45 years or whatever, and it outlived the company that made it. The Interstate Bakeries filed for bankruptcy in 2012. And the case now sits in the headmaster's office, and she was one of the students in the original class that put it in that case all those years ago. Chainsaws are the tool of the trade, certainly in the lumber areas, primarily western northern Maine. And there's a museum up in the village of Allagash that commemorates that history of chainsaws from 1920s when they were first used, and when they actually were so big it took two people to operate them. And Louis Pelletier, the man in the check shirt on the left next to television personality Bill Green, has created this museum. He has over 400 chainsaws, almost all of which he has restored to operating condition. And you can visit that, and there are some that were mounted on wheels. And the other claim to fame is that right down the road is his sister, is award-winning writer Kathy Pelletier, who also lives in Allagash. So if you get a chance up in that neck of the woods, be sure to pop in and see that. One of the things we found in a lot of research is you find that things aren't always what they used to appear. And there was a story told about the wreck of the Grand Design, a schooner that supposedly went aground off Mount Desert Island, trying to get into a cove, and all the colonists were thrown ashore. Some tried to go overland and try to find help, and disappeared and were never heard from again. Well, come to find out, that was not true. There was never actually a vessel called the Grand Design. And even though a plaque had been erected in Acadia National Park before it was the park where this supposedly took place near Southwest Harbor, come to find out, the Grand Design was the name of a company that planned to sail to the North America and establish their own colony. And they got shipwrecked on Grand Manan up in New Brunswick, actually, just over the border from Maine. And in 1853, some people in the town of Warren got all the details mixed up and started this whole conspiracy that the Grand Design wrecked on Mount Desert Island and all that kind of thing. Actually, the colonists all would have died if it had not been for the Native Americans in that area, who helped keep them alive until help could reach them. Eventually, the national park was informed about the error of this design, and so that monument no longer exists near Ship Harbor in Acadia. Certainly, folks in 1927 were surprised that we're on Old Orchard Beach when Lindbergh in the Spirit of St. Louis dropped out of the sky and landed on the sand. And it was after his record transatlantic crossing. He was supposed to speak in Portland, and it was too foggy to land there. And the beach was the town's official landing strip, and other aircraft were operating from there. There were hangars. And so he landed on the beach, got whisked away in a car to Portland, made his speaking engagement, and then returned and took off and flew off into the sky. He actually visited a guy named Harry Jones, who had a plane there, who was Maine's first mail carrying pilot. Lindbergh had other ties to Maine. In the bottom right corner, the packing crate that was used to bring his aircraft back from Paris to the United States after his record-setting flight was turned into a museum of Lindbergh memorabilia in the town of Canaan. For many years, that was open to the public, but now it's privately owned, and it's not. And then his wife used to spend Anne Morrow Lindbergh, a great author and record-setting aviator, first woman to do many accomplishments in airplanes, used to spend a lot of time on the island of North Haven. So Maine has a lot of connections to that. Cold ears while ice skating was reportedly the inspiration for 15-year-old Chester Greenwood of Farmington. He asked his grandmother to take a piece of metal wire and sew some beaver fur to it so that he could keep his ears closed warm. And so they caught on, and he started making them. He got a patent for it. 1936 alone, his company made and shipped 400,000 pairs of earmuffs. They also went on. He started a bicycle business, created the town's first telephone network, and tinkered with heating system technology. And since 1997, they celebrate Chester Greenwood Day in Farmington with parades and lots of other events. Another inventor from Maine was Sir Hiram Maxim, who was a native of Sangerville, whose claim to fame was the machine gun, which he developed with a gentleman named Vickers from England. And it could shoot 500 rounds a minute, using the energy from from the previous round. He also had a claim to fame that he designed amusement rides, flying machines, and he claims Thomas Edison stole the idea for the incandescent light bulb from him, but we never know for sure on that. When he tested his machine gun in his local garden, he reportedly ran newspaper ads warning people to keep their windows open so the glass wouldn't shatter. Not surprisingly, he ended up suffering from deafness later in years, but was knighted by Queen Victoria in 1900. But as small as Sangerville is, and it's a small town up not too far from between Greenville and Dover Foxcroft area, there were 2 knights from there, including Sir Harry Oakes. He grew up there in Sangerville, and he always wanted to seek his fortune and make a lot of money. So he left at a young age in his late teens, and he went in search of gold. He was shipwrecked in Alaska and held prisoner by Russians. Finally, in Ontario, he struck it rich, earning as much as $60,000 a day. He was knighted by King George VI in 1939. Oakes had a mansion in Bar Harbor, which is the center picture, where he lived many summers, but he also spent time in the Bahamas, where in 1943 he was bludgeoned to death, but no one was ever found responsible for that killing. And to this day, his mansion in Bar Harbor is now part of the Atlantic Oceanside Inn and Conference Center. We talk about presidential visits, but Rangeley really liked Ike. President Eisenhower decided to come visit and do some fishing. He was an avid angler in 1955. And he arrived surrounded by a swarm of Secret Service agents and more than 70 reporters. That first day, he didn't have a single bite. And that evening, his guide, Don Cameron, who you see a picture in the painting of in the center, got on the phone from the camps where they were staying, called all his guide friends and other people he knew, including the wardens who were reportedly in on it, asked them to catch every big fish they could and take them up and put them in the pool at the base of Little Boy Falls on the McGalloway River. So the next morning at breakfast, the guy told the president, well, let's go back there again, because the president hadn't gotten a single bite there. They'd put a small net across downstream so the fish couldn't escape. I cast out, caught a giant trout on his first cast and was quite pleased. And there's actually the Republican Women's Federation of Maine. They put a bronze plaque there, and that's now called the Eisenhower Pool, just so that they kind of know. Eisenhower was a talented oil painter and painted that picture of Don Cameron that you see in the center and gave it to him as a memento and a thank you for guiding him through the woods. And that's now at the Outdoor Heritage Museum in Oquassic. Right down the road from there is the hilltop home of Wilhelm Reich. And he is one of the strangest characters. He pioneered research into what he called Oregon energy, and it supposedly promoted biological and sexual health and vitality. He wasn't just a complete mad scientist. He had connections to Sigmund Freud. He also conducted some experiments when he was in Europe with Albert Einstein, but he was considered a quack, certainly by the medical energy, and he had his devices that he claimed could consolidate this organ energy and use it to heal cancer and all these other things. On the right is a picture of what he called a cloud buster. He could take this universal energy and make it rain, and he would hire himself out to farmers in different areas of the country. Eventually, all his books and everything was banned. By 1947, a lot of his pamphlets and books were gathered and burned in New York City. And in 1956, he was sent to jail for being a charlatan and a con artist. Unfortunately, he died in prison just a few days before he would get out. But you can tour his home now on Dodge Point Road in Rangeley. And it definitely is a different kind of sensation when you're there. And it's a lot of his experiments and his laboratory and everything is right there. Maine has no shortage of things that go bump in the night. And certainly when you're in a small community and it's 100 years ago and there's no lights, there's nobody else around, and you hear strange noises. So, excuse me, there's, in the book, we talk about the Cherryfield Goat Man, the Turner Beast, the Phippsburg Screecher, and the Medibemps Howler. And of course, Casco Bay's Cassie the Sea Monster. So you never know what you're going to find when you're out in the woods, and there's still parts of Maine probably no one has set foot in, so who knows what's there. One of my favorite places in Maine is the solar system model along Route 1 in Aroostook County, and it stretches 40 miles from Holton all the way to the University of Maine at Presque Isle, where the sun is in the auditorium, and lowly Pluto, before it was demoted from planetary status, is in a little picture frame on the information center in Holton. But it's at scale, it's actually at scale. So for the size of the different planets like Jupiter, Saturn, those are 4 and 5 feet. When you drive it, you're actually traveling it faster than the speed of light on a scale basis. So you can be the fastest kind of people in the universe. They do celebrate it with an annual festival, what they call Planet Head Day, where people color their heads or wear hats to commemorate the different planets, and you can go up there and do that. Over the years, they've expanded it. It now goes dozens of miles south of Holton and into Canada on the other end to include the Oort cloud and some of the other dwarf protoplanets that are out there. And then finally, of course, you can't have all these mythical beasts without some place to go and see more about them. And Maine has the world's only international cryptozoology museum, which is in Portland, Maine. And you can go and visit. It was established by a man named Lauren Coleman, and he has a 9-foot tall Bigfoot and reportedly has actual samples of Yeti hair from the Himalayas, and the Jersey Devil and the skunk ape and a bunch of other different things. It's located on Thompson's Point, conveniently right next door to the Bissell Brothers brewery, and pub. So if you want to go for a nice afternoon, find out about lots of strange subjects of which nobody but these folks are the experts, you can do that and have a nice lunch too. So that's pretty much my prepared talk, and I'm happy to entertain any questions. I hope I haven't droned on too long while we were doing this.
So while we wait and see if folks have any questions, and feel free again to add them to the Q&A. I wanted to ask one here. Do you think Maine is getting less weird over time? It looks like a lot of examples are from the 20th century. Has Maine gotten more normal? What does that mean?
Well, it's interesting. There's definitely there's more homogenization of culture than there, say, were in the previous century. But, another example, there's a lobster pound place here on Mount Desert Island over in Southwest Harbor where the owner supposedly calms the lobsters they're about to cook with marijuana essence to ease their transition to your luncheon plate. So I think that I think there's a lot of good quirky things still going on in Maine. There's a lot of strange vehicles. There's still legends being formed, I think.
We've got a couple people sending thank yous for the presentation in the comments.
Well, we want to thank you guys for having me today. It's a fun subject. Out of the 300 in the book, I actually collected information on about 600 of them. 2,500 images I gathered just as a pool to pick from, and it's really just scratched the surface.
And before we head out for the day, are you working on anything new or upcoming that people can look forward to?
I have been working on a book based on a 4-part newspaper series I did a few years back. During World War II, there was a Navy blimp that went down off Mount Desert Island. And the official inquest said that it crashed. Excuse me, but how does something that's lighter than air crash? There was ample evidence that it may have engaged a Nazi submarine. And so I'm doing some research on that just to see what might have really happened. And there's a lot of information. There was a lot going on off the Maine coast that people were totally unaware of during World War II.
We do have one question we can squeeze in here too. How long did it take you to do research for this book?
Well, it's funny, when I'm working on one book, I'm starting to collect notes for the next book. So, and I always seem more excited about the next one. So I actually started back in 2015 when I was working on the Return to Moose River book, and I'd come across stories of remarkable historical accomplishments or quirky little things about backwoods residents and things. And so I just started a file, and that just grew until you finally say, oh, there's a book here. So really the actual research and starting to collect things were over several years, but it took about a year to actually narrow it down and put the final book together.
So before we break for the day, we got a couple comments from people who just mentioned how fun and informative the presentation was. So just a reminder to everyone that you can check out a copy of Earl's book from the library. Actually, many libraries in Maine own it. So depending on where you are, you can definitely check that out. And if you'd like to share this presentation with anyone, we have a couple educators who have commented that their students would be interested in this. The whole entire talk will be on YouTube, on the library's YouTube page starting tomorrow. And if you've registered on Zoom, you'll actually receive a link to the YouTube page tomorrow in your email. Otherwise, you can just head on over to YouTube and search for the Lewiston Public Library and you'll be able to see it there. I wanna thank you again for joining us today, Earl. This was fascinating. And I look forward to reading more from you in the future.
Well, thank you, and thank you for what your library does and what libraries all over Maine do. You have been great cultural reservoirs for people and resources in difficult times.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. Have a good one.